Greetings, everyone. If I could get your attention back again, we're going to continue on. So if you need to have a conversation, if you take it to the hallway. Otherwise, onward. And and when my slides are ready, we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. As mentioned, I am Jeff Ackermann. I currently chair the Public Utilities Commission here in Colorado. And so going to give you a little different slice on your conversation here. Once the slides are, there we go. So in your program, you will see that that's the title of what I'm here to talk about. What I'm actually going to talk about is nothing about finance, because I really don't know that much about finance. I'm going to talk about regulation. Yeah, actually, I'm going to talk to you about regulation, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to talk about regulation because that's my strength, and you learn to play to your strength. And also, somebody needs to do it, kind of thing. So also, as a commissioner, I have a disclaimer, like coffee cups do. You don't need to read that. Thank you. I've now disclaimed what I'm going to say. The first thing I want to bring to your attention, I think the place to start the conversation actually, is I was curious as to what's the mission of the institute that I'm coming to be a guest of. So I looked at that, and what intrigued me is just this. In terms of that reference to, this is right off the website, and the point I really want to draw your attention to is specifically that rapid implementation at speed and scale of renewable energy. So I took that to heart, and I'm going to speak to you about that. And I'm also sensitive that it's about your 14th presentation, so we're going to cut to the chase. I'm going to tell you what you're going to hear, and then I'm going to tell you it again. So I'm going to talk to you about utility regulation. I'm going to explain to you why utility regulation is integral to renewable energy implementation, which is the mission of the Institute. I also want to point out that utility regulation is not only poorly understood, it borders on misunderstood or malaligned or misaligned, or it's not in a good place, and I'm going to try and speak to that briefly. And with your help, and I'm actually here to enlist your help, I want to show you how utility regulation can improve the speed and scale of implementation of renewable energy. So, drawing on that point, back to the mission about rapid implementation at speed and scale. Previous to joining the Utility Commission as chairman in January and being staff there for 6 years, in between there I was also the director of the Energy Office for Governor Hickenlooper. So I learned that market implementation and changing markets has several factors. I'm well aware that technology is a big piece of it, especially disruptive technology, and we played a role at the Energy Office, and the Commission plays a role in understanding that technology, and I'm glad that's a big part of your reason for being here together today and throughout the week. There's a lot of other better presenters on that. I'm also well aware that technology is driven by economics in terms of as it moves into the market. And this is a governor who really prides himself on that and learned a lot from being around him on understanding that. But it also is driven by capital, which we were just talking a bit about, and I know there's more conversation about that. But ultimately, what I'm trying to draw your attention to is that underlying all of that, and again playing to my niche, is public policy. And public policy is the sort of milieu in which a lot of that is swimming. And I'm, again, playing to both public policy and specifically to regulatory policy. So my first premise for you in my presentation is to put in front of you the notion that regulation is basically applied governance. And so this is my attempt to help you get a new sense of what is regulation and to understand, if not actually appreciate, regulation. And I am setting that out as an objective, that you could appreciate the role of regulation. I'm going to have you journey back to about junior high civics class for a couple minutes with me. It says, I think you need to understand that we work with underlying principles, both in our governance, which was discussed earlier this morning, and appreciate those presentations, but also is underlying regulation, that we are looking as a way of how do you do public discourse and decision making. That's the essence of why we govern ourselves. That's the essence of why we come together. And it's in pursuit of the common good. This is really the underlying principles, and I'm going to bring you back to those principles. We talked about those this morning. We talked about how those are kind of waning at times, if not misunderstood. If I had more time, I would show you why so much of our civic discourse is really damaged by not really reconnecting back to those principles, whether you're talking about appropriate taxation for roads and bridges or anything else. We're missing the mark. Suffice to say, my life, I swim in that a lot, so I'm aware of that. I'm sensitive to that. I'm also well aware of an error on the screen. So I'm also well aware in swimming in that arena that for better or for worse, I can be part of the problem. So that these are actual real media headlines that I've had to live through in the last few months and being on the commission. So I'm well aware that the commission itself doesn't always do its own best work of helping people understand where we focus and should focus. But that's the world I live in right now, and you're welcome to it. I want to take you as well for just a quick minute to that junior high civics. And what I'm pointing out here is if we think about what's underlying our governance and whether or not that's a dying art that we need to reinvigorate, and this goes to some of the other presentations you heard today, it's good to be reminded that we should always be striving for an identity greater than ourselves, and that some of the great thought leaders of our time were trying to articulate that to us, that there is virtue in bringing forums together where you have civic discourse and you try to resolve problems reasonably, acknowledge grievances, but have a reasonable approach to conflict resolution, and that power is something you have to always know where it is, how it's being distributed, how it's being constrained, and how it's being used appropriately. That is the essence of so much, and I think you heard that in some of the opening presentations this morning. We still are struggling with how to make that work in governance and civics at large. I want to tie that back to the world of regulation and utility regulation particularly, because this is our Western heritage. This is our story. This is part of our cultural story out of which regulation comes. And out of that, if you look at that Western civilization story, and kudos to that conversation from Maggie about cultural narrative earlier, right before lunch, this is part of our collective narrative that we need to reinvigorate and remind ourselves as a large community across the country, that we strive for fairness and justice, that we strive for protection or safety of those in society at large or as a whole, or those that need it the most, and that we're pursuing the common good, and we're out to protect the common good. Those are our principles, and it's always good to re-articulate those. The terminology alters over time, but especially these are the same principles that we are striving for and are the basis of my work and my colleagues' work at the Utility Commission. My next premise for you is when you look at regulation, I would contend for you that if governance is something that showed you on that earlier slide has a good long Western history, regulation is still relatively young. And it's born out in that my premise is that regulation is born out of a collision between governance and complexity. And I want to spend a minute or two on that. That notion that this Western or Republic model of governance, or the voice of the people, is what we've been learning perpetually how to manifest, how to use better. But at the same time, we have this persistent movement, and we swim in different arenas that are increasingly complex. And so that what seemed to be a part-time thing to sit down and solve a problem now requires full-time professionals delving into very deeply, especially in my world of electric utilities. The utility system I'm trying to regulate is not Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Station trying to DC power the neighborhood. There's a little bit more going on in that sense of complexity. And so just to spend a minute on complexity, let's just talk about that. Complexity, whether it's, this is sort of my liberal arts background playing out more than anything else, but you can find complexity whether you talk about biology and the great images we saw right before lunch, or whether you talk about human organizations, but complexity is also manifest in the electric utility system. It's a lot different system than even the one I was introduced to when I was doing low-income energy efficiency work 30 years ago and trying to help folks be a consumer in that system. So my first conclusion for you is that utility regulation is now continuously striving and struggling, if not losing the struggle, to keep up with utility system complexity. And so when we are trying to pursue fairness or safety or the common good, which we refer to as the public interest in our work in regulation, that we are constantly battling ourselves to figure out how can we manifest a system that is as appropriately complex as the world that we're trying to regulate. In this case, it's electricity. We deal with the same in telecommunications or other transportation network companies is a fun one too. But so in that space, my next point for you is, so how do I now connect this to renewable energy, which is what we're all about? And what does this mean for renewable energy advocates? The first point is that to draw your attention, not just to the 10% of the US's consumption and how much comes out of renewables, but to draw you to the second point there, in those numbers there, of what comprises our renewable energy. I'll pull that to the next slide so you can see it more meaningfully. Those are the 4 sectors of the economy where renewable energy is in play. And the point is that the majority share of it currently is electric power. It's not exclusively, but a lot of the conversation is in electric power. And secondly, that it's not only there, and I commend to you, there's a lot of good articles. This is one from the Regulatory Assistance Project, a lot of good former regulators that help current regulators navigate through this arena. But that beneficial electrification is now sort of the term of art, of that if, as part of the path forward, it's not just how do we move the electric system to decarbonizing, but how do we move the economy toward electrification in step with more of a renewable-based system that feeds parts of the economy that aren't currently electrified, whether that's transportation, whether that's home heating and other space heating, whether that's more water heating. Those two things go hand in hand. So that the point being that the lion's share of renewable energy activity is going to be happening in the electric sector. That's the first point. The second point is using Colorado as an example. The map you're looking at shows you the rural electric co-ops, the municipal utilities, and then Xcel Energy is that darkish blue area, and then Black Hills is the other dark blue area. That's what we regulate. In terms of geography, is a small portion. In terms of people, it's 57% of the electricity sold in the state is through utilities that are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. So what I'm trying to put together there is to introduce you to my world, that putting those 2 points together, that the Utility Commission, although we don't regulate all of the electric activity in Colorado, where most of the renewable activity in Colorado is going to happen, we are dealing with the majority share of that, and many times the first movers of what happens in that arena will move to the other arenas next. And so from there, applying this now to my second conclusion, that the Utility Commission can significantly affect the implementation and speed and scale of renewable energy in Colorado and in any other state that you're engaged with. If we're aware of the principles that we're trying to articulate, and if we recognize these are the types of things that in any given year are happening in a utility commission such as Colorado's, whether we're dealing with what are the next set of assets to be purchased or how to comply with the renewable energy standards such as we have in Colorado, energy efficiency, grid modernization, and the like. Yet, as noted earlier, the complexity is going to be a continual burden upon a utility commission such as Colorado's. And so, you know, kind of quoting out of Hamlet, there lies the rub. The issue many times is what do we do with complexity as a regulator, as a group of people, as society? Many times what you see is a big part of what we experienced in 2016 is if something's complex, simplify it. And then that seemed to unfortunately work. But I think as Angela Merkel points out, be wary of simple solutions to complex problems. I think furthermore, you know, as Plato points out, that there's one risk is to oversimplify, another risk is just to say, I can't figure this out, I don't need to be involved. The point in driving it right back home to the world of renewable energy and utility regulation is the risk that when we're talking, for example, about rooftop solar, great thing to engage in, net metering, fascinating topic that I've thrown myself into more than I want to. But the point being, and it was discussed in one of the panels earlier today, and I dangerously kind of toss it back to you, is when we use language like my right to solar is a fascinating phrase, but dangerously oversimplifies a very complex conversation. Because my right to solar, yeah, sure, if you wish to leave the system, you have the right to do whatever you wish. But we have a collective understanding that we're still part of a system, and we have to have a more engaged, more thoughtful, more complex conversation about what it means to still be part of a system. Because, as often is the case, there's a lot of simple but wrong solutions, and the challenge is to figure out what is the complex way forward. I'm very intrigued, for example, with the conversation about Hawaii. Hawaii is out there on the front edge and showing us how to set a vision and say we can build an entire system that's 100% renewable. Aspen has set that and committed to that and is articulating that, and with the support of NREL analyzing that. We need to not oversimplify that down to a marketing scheme, but to explain to people that the pursuit of a 100% renewable system has a lot of moving pieces, including new rate design, including who's going to have access behind your meter and whether or not you are open to having others engage in your home in a different way, whether you are going to need to purchase different types of appliances over time, whose ox is gored, how do we deal with stranded assets. There's a lot to deal with there that the average voter, ratepayer, and the like may not know, may or may not care about, but is going to be where the real proverbial rubber hits the road on this. And so, with that, these are the types of issues that Colorado is going to see in the years ahead. just to quickly show you what's coming down the pike. These are already here, if not, are going to be here in a few years. These are the things that keep me up at night, that I realize I'm needing to figure out with the regulatory structure I have today, how to deal with the issues coming at me down in the future. And so, 2 slides to go here. One is to say, basically, the path forward. I think part of that path forward is making sure, first off, it's not about who's right and who's wrong and who's the enemy. That's a dangerous place to start and doesn't get us very far. Secondly, is I need help of the experts to understand that systems thinking needs to be brought into the regulatory process, so we take a more comprehensive understanding of what we're doing and why. And then third, there are, I'm sure, 21st century decision-making models that I kind of know just intuitively, but I need to know where are they, how can they be brought into regulatory practices, and how, when we open up a rulemaking, I can get folks to come articulate those to us. So how to do this? I need folks to thus be informed about the regulatory process, to be engaged in that process in your own way, but it starts by understanding what this process is about, and to take your thoughts and your expertise from whatever background you're working from and help bring it into my world. I'm looking for your kind of help because I and all regulators are going to need to move our regulatory process forward. With that, I think if you improve the process, you improve the outcomes, and through that, you have an impact on renewable energy. There's regulatory utility thinking right there. Thank you much.